back to my channel. In this video I wanted to talk to you about a recent article I read about autism in Spectrum magazine, which is an online magazine, sort of scientific magazine, which covers the latest research in autism, and I recently came across an article on there which really interested me because it's very relevant to my own life, and I could completely relate to what the article was talking about. It's like an aha moment. So I wanted to sort of talk to you about the article because it was quite exciting for me. Now, the article is about autism and anxiety, and it's titled Amygdala Development Diverges in Autism Specific Anxiety. So the amygdala is a small part of the brain. It's like there's one amygdala in each hemisphere of the brain, so there's two in total. So we're really talking about amygdala in the plural, like amygdalae. And it's involved in fear and emotion processing. Now, the research, which was focused on autistic children, although I presume it also applies to adults, but maybe they'll need to sort of replicate it in adults as well, to see if this pattern is stable over time, because the research was just looking at children, but it's still interesting. The research showed that the amygdala develops differently in autistic children with anxiety than in either autistic children without anxiety or non-autistic children. So in other words, autistic children with anxiety have differences in their amygdala that sort of sets them apart from other groups of children, be they autistic or non-autistic, who don't have anxiety. So that was the first thing that was found out. But there's a further distinction in a group of autistic children who experience anxiety, because so autistic children who have anxiety, first of all, have differences in their amygdala that is not apparent in autistic children without anxiety and non-autistics. So there's something different about the group of autistic kids who have anxiety that distinguishes them from their autistic peers who don't have anxiety, and also non-autistic children. But there's also another distinction, a further distinction, that separates autistic children who have so-called Autism Specific Anxiety, which I'll get onto in a moment, and those with more traditional anxiety. So autistic children who have anxiety all have differences in their amygdala, but the difference in the amygdala is different depending on whether the anxiety they experience is so-called autism-specific anxiety, or whether the anxiety they experience is more traditional DSM anxiety. Some researchers have proposed that an autism-specific form of anxiety can occur along with, I guess as a sort of comorbid, if you like, or instead of the types defined in a DSM. So it could even potentially be a distinct form of autism, a particular subgroup of autism. Just turn the light on. That's better, isn't it? Heavily characterised by this autism-specific anxiety. So it could either be a distinct form of autism, alternatively it could be a comorbid condition that comorbid condition that goes along with other types of autism. It could also be a standalone, unique subgroup of autism, and that's what they need to further sort of find out and clarify. So autism-specific anxiety. So what does autism-specific anxiety mean, essentially? So autism-specific anxiety usually involves a very strong fear, a high degree of anxiety around losing access to a special interest or worry over possible disruptions to routine. Now, obviously, as part of being autistic, most autistic people, need routine, and it's very common for autistic people to develop very strong interests. But obviously, all autistic people are different, and for some autistic people, that might not be a very big part of their autism. But for other autistic people, that could be a really big part of their autism. Because, like I say, all autistic people are different, so the extent of a particular trait or the intensity of a particular trait, how apparent it is obviously going to vary a great deal. So some autistic people might not need much routine, but that might only be a very small part of their autism. For other autistic people, that's a really big part of their autism. And if you're an autistic person with autism specific anxiety, that need for routine and special interest is going to be a really, really extreme part of your autism, to such an extent that it causes this overwhelming anxiety over possible threat to that routine or threat to very special interest. And I was like, oh my god, when I read this, because that is a really, really big part of my autism, and is a big driving force of my issues, really. Is that obviously I do have a very, very great fear of losing access to my special interests, not being able to pursue them, things going wrong, things messing them up, my routine being disturbed. I have a lot of anxiety over this, and unpredictability causes me a lot of anxiety in my life, and has done for as long as I can remember in different ways. So this, I was like, yes, I have autism specific anxiety, that's what it is. And I've always kind of felt, intuitively anyway, that the anxiety I experience is not traditional, that it is embedded in my autism, that it's like sort of grown organically out of my autism, as I've talked in another video. I already sort of intuitively knew that anyway, that it's kind of ego-syntonic, because it's not something I see as alien to myself, it's inherent in how I am. It doesn't make me unhappy, it's inherent to how I am. It's different to the traditional DSM anxiety. It's often someone sort of like resists or like makes them unwell or makes them depressed and everything. I've always felt that it's 100% embedded in my neurology, that it's connected to the autism. So this article just confirmed that, but it just gave it a more, it just clarified it, and it's called Autism Specific Anxiety. So it's actually a thing. And not all autistic people have it. It's very common for autistic people to have anxiety. I think over 2/3 do, but it's very common. But not all autistic people have anxiety. It's not like all autistic people, otherwise it'd be 100%. But a lot of autistic people have anxiety, but not all of those autistic people who have anxiety would have the autism-specific anxiety. Some will have more traditional DSM-based anxiety, things like social phobia, more traditional classic OCD and things like that. Now, it is actually possible to have both autism-specific anxiety and traditional anxiety at the same time. So you can have both. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So you could have that extreme fear around routine, special interest, that could be a big part of your anxiety, but you could also have, say, more traditional classic OCD, more traditional DSM type anxiety alongside of that. And I would say that does apply to me. I do have a bit of both, but I would say that autism-specific anxiety is the main form of anxiety I experience. Like, for example, all my fears around illness and things like that are largely based around my fear of my routine being disrupted, not being able to pursue my normal routines, the sort of catastrophe that might happen of me not being able to pursue my normal routines, and also the kind of fear around the unknown and unpredictability inherent in illness, where it's something happening to you that's outside of your control. And a big part of my autism is that I cannot bear lack of control and feeling vulnerable, and I need to be in control all the time. I don't want any change to my body, any change to how I feel is really disturbing. And obviously illness and things like that is a change to how I feel, so obviously I'm going to go out of my way to try and avoid something I know causes me a lot of pain. Obviously no one likes being ill, obviously, but clearly most people don't have a fear of illness to the extent I do, because otherwise everyone would be like I am. And like I say, a lot of this does come out of my autism, so I feel that autism-specific anxiety is a really big driver for me. And this article was just so interesting because it just clarified it. Now, the research has shown that autistic people with this form of anxiety, autism-specific anxiety, which is heavily focused around loss of routines and fear around interest being disturbed, and a kind of very controlling, kind of rigid form of anxiety, I guess you could call it, autistic people with this form of anxiety, according to research, as I said before, this applies to autistic children, so they would have to do further studies in adults to see if this continues over time, because this research is just focused on children. So autistic children, I should say, with this form of anxiety, tend to have an unusually small amygdala. So their amygdala, for some reason, is a lot smaller, they found, than autistic children without autism specific anxiety, and autistic children who have more traditional anxiety as well, who don't have this small amygdala. And they need to be able to find out what it is. What variable is driving this? Why is this specific anxiety that comes out of fears around loss of routine or special interests? Why is this autism-specific anxiety manifest differently on a neuronal level to more traditional anxiety? That's what they need to try. There's clearly something going on here. Why is it different? That's what we need to find out. Now, the study did exclude those with OCD, because obviously if they included people with OCD, which is a more traditional DSM anxiety, which isn't based usually around loss of routine or special interests, that would obviously add noise to the data, and that would be a confounding variable, so they had to exclude autistic children with OCD. And this revealed a new trend of... So excluding those with OCD, so we're just focusing here on anxiety but not OCD, just so that there's no confounding variables. This revealed a new trend of a large amygdala, so the opposite pattern of to a small amygdala, a large amygdala in autistic children with DSM anxiety. So autistic children who have more traditional DSM anxiety, that's Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, by the way, which is the main diagnostic category, catalogue. Autistic children who have more traditional DSM anxiety, so that would be things like social phobia, I'm just trying to think now, maybe general anxiety disorder, for ones that are sort of listed in the DSM. They tend to have a large amygdala, so they also have differences in their amygdala compared to autistic children without any anxiety and non-autistics. But they show the opposite pattern to autistic children with the autism-specific anxiety. And by the way, none of these changes were seen in autistic children who didn't have any anxiety at all. So you might have a group of autistic children, but there's differences in the brain based upon whether they have anxiety and also what anxiety it is that they're experiencing. That sets them apart and suggests they have a particular subgroups of autism based around this. So it said that this potentially defines a subtype of autism, and they need to do more research into this. Now, as I said before, it is possible to have DSM anxiety and autism-specific anxiety together, and I would like to know, how does that affect the brain? Does that mean that the amygdala is kind of intermediate between small and large? That's what I was wondering. If you have both types, how would that affect the amygdala? And obviously, we don't know what's cause and effect. Does this anxiety cause the changes in the amygdala we don't know what's cause and effect. We don't know whether the differences in the amygdala cause the anxiety, or whether the anxiety itself has a downstream effect and then affects the amygdala later on. What is the original cause? Because obviously anxiety itself and how we think and how we feel can also, affect what happens in the brain. So we need to distinguish what's cause from effect, and what is the original variable that results in a sort of chain reaction, if you like, in the brain. Some researchers have suggested a social stress model, which is the idea that obviously being autistic means you experience a hell of a lot of stress in your life, and then this can affect the brain and sort of things, and have sort of downstream effects. And it said autistic children with DSM anxiety, so things like more like social phobia, general anxiety disorder, that sort of thing, they had an enlarged white amygdala compared to their non-autistic peers. So they showed the opposite pattern to those with autism-specific anxiety that had a smaller amygdala. Autistics with, as I said already, autistics with autism-specific anxiety had a slower white amygdala development. So very, very, very interesting research, and I hope they do more to find out more what goes on, because this was really very interesting for me. Because that is, like I said, that's the big driver of everything I experience. And I'm a very, 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 very anxious person. very control freak, you could call it in an extreme way. I mean, I'm very controlling. I have been all my life, it's just how I am. So this might explain what's going on. So do let me know if any of you feel that you might have autism specific anxiety. Let me know if you think you have more traditional anxiety. Let me know if you have both. And also let me know if you're autistic who doesn't have any anxiety. Because like I said, not all autistic people have anxiety. It's very, very, very common. It's the rule rather than the exception. But there are autistics who don't have anxiety, or who seem to avoid a lot of anxiety in their life. So I'd be very interested to know. So thank you for watching.